What if I told you that the New Testament mentions the sisters of Jesus? Not once, twice. 2 separate Gospels acknowledge that Jesus of Nazareth had sisters. They confirm it. They say the words. And in both places, both times, they do the exact same thing. They refuse to give a single name. Not one name. Not one word about who these women were, where they went, what they believed, or what happened to them when the movement their brother started changed the world forever. For the brothers of Jesus, the Gospels have no such problem. Mark chapter 6, verse 3. Let me read it to you, exactly as it was written down 2,000 years ago. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joses, and of Judah, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? 4 brothers, 4 names: James, Joses, Judah, Simon, written down in the 1st century. Copied and recopied through 20 centuries of transmission, those names survived because someone decided they were worth preserving. Someone in the chain of transmission looked at those names and said, "These matter. These stay." And then the verse continues. Are not his sisters here with us? His sisters, plural, present in that town, present in that moment, woven into the living memory of the community that knew Jesus of Nazareth personally, and their names were not written down. That is not carelessness, that is a choice. Now hear what Matthew says in chapter 13, verse 56. And his sisters, are they not all with us? All of them. That word carries weight. Not one sister, not 2. All of them. A plurality large enough that Matthew reached for a word of totality to contain it. 3 sisters at minimum. Possibly more. Women who grew up in the same household as Jesus, who knew him before any disciple ever heard his name, who were present when this entire story began. And Matthew, having confirmed there were many of them, having used that word all, gives you nothing else. No name, no face, no trace of who these women were. Nothing. The brothers got names. The sisters got silence. Who decided the brothers deserved names and the sisters did not? Who was in the room when that decision was made? And why has no one asked that question loudly enough for 2,000 years? Because those names did not disappear on their own. They were not lost to careless scribes or dissolving papyrus. The canonical Gospels name those brothers clearly and repeatedly. The sisters were mentioned and then deliberately left blank. For most of that time, people who read those 2 verses accepted the silence as natural. They assumed it reflected ancient custom, that women were simply unnamed in texts like these. But that assumption falls apart the moment you keep reading. The same Gospels that refused to name the sisters of Jesus named Mary Magdalene. They named Joanna. They named Susanna. They named Mary of Clopas. They named Salome. The ancient world was perfectly capable of writing women's names into the record when those names were permitted to survive. The silence around the sisters of Jesus is not a custom. It is a decision. Chosen silences in documents this important always have reasons behind them. Now here is where the story shifts. The day that Jesus was crucified, the men who had sworn to follow him to the end had fled. The inner circle was gone, hidden, paralyzed, but 4 women did not run. 4 women stood at the foot of the cross, while the rest of the world looked away. The Gospel of John records them in chapter 19, verse 25. His mother, Mary the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, and one more, described only as his mother's sister. His mother's sister. She is at the crucifixion. She is one of 4 people in the world who refused to abandon him in the worst moment that story ever reached. And John will not give her a name. He defines her entirely through someone else's identity. She has no name of her own in that verse. She exists only in relation to Mary. But the Gospel of Mark does something different. In chapter 15, verse 40, Mark names the women at the cross, and one of them is called Salome. Mark tells us she had followed Jesus all the way from Galilee. She had served him, traveled with him, been part of the movement from its earliest days. She was not someone who showed up at the end. She was there from the beginning. And then in chapter 16, verse 1, when the women go to anoint the body of Jesus at dawn, Salome is there again. She is one of the 3 people present at the moment that changes all of history. Salome was at the cross. Salome was at the tomb. And no canonical gospel ever explains who she was in relation to Jesus or his family. If you have ever felt that something was deliberately removed from what you were taught about this story, you were right. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell, because what is coming next has been buried for nearly 2,000 years. Salome's name does not disappear when you step outside the 4 canonical Gospels. It grows. It surfaces in a 2nd century Gospel that was copied and read in communities across Egypt, a Gospel where Salome sits across from Jesus himself and asks him the questions that the official tradition decided no one should be allowed to hear. A Gospel where she is called his disciple, using the feminine form of that word, which was an extraordinary designation in that world at that time. A Gospel where Jesus answers her as an equal, as someone who belongs in that conversation, as someone he trusts with the most difficult truths he had to offer. According to the evidence that survived, Salome was not a figure at the edge of the story. She was present at its center. She had a name. She had a voice. She had words exchanged directly with Jesus that were recorded in a text that thousands of people once read in their communities and considered sacred. And then, systematically, over the course of generations, every copy of that gospel ceased to exist as an independent document. Not by accident, not by the slow decay of time, by institutional decision, by theological pressure, by the same process that shaped the official record into the form you received it in and removed everything the official record could not accommodate. What we have of those conversations today survives only because the man who worked hardest to destroy the gospel's influence quoted it in order to condemn it. He preserved it by arguing against it. He gave us her words in the act of trying to erase them, and that is why we are here. By the end of this video, you will know what that gospel said. You will know her name. You will know who decided those words were too dangerous to survive, and you will understand why, after nearly 20 centuries of institutional suppression, they are still here. The silence around the Sisters of Jesus didn't happen by accident. It was maintained across generations, across continents, across centuries of copying and translating and transmitting the Christian record. To understand how deliberate that silence was, you need to understand what happened to the brothers. Because the brothers of Jesus were tracked. They were identified. Their names were written down, not just in the Gospels, but in the historical documents of the 2nd century, in the records of Christians who had every reason to be precise about exactly who was related to Jesus and who was not. There was a Christian writer named Hegesippus. He was born around the year 107 AD, and he spent decades traveling through the Christian communities of the Mediterranean world, documenting what he found. He arrived in Rome under Pope Anicetus, sometime around the 150s or 160s. He wrote in the time of Pope Eleuterus, whose pontificate ran through the 170s and into the 180s. He gathered everything he could find into a 5-volume work he called the Hypomnemata, the Memorials. And then that work was almost entirely lost. What we have of it exists only in fragments quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea, who preserved pieces of it in his Ecclesiastical History, written in the early 4th century. But here's what's crucial. In those surviving fragments, Hegesippus is meticulous about the family of Jesus. He uses a specific Greek word for the brothers of Jesus, adelphoi to Kyriou, brothers of the Lord. That phrase is not a general term. It is a technical designation, a specific category of relationship that Hegesippus treats as distinct and important, and he makes the distinction even sharper by contrast. When he refers to Simeon, the son of Clopas, he does not call him a brother of the Lord. He calls him the Lord's cousin. The Greek word he uses for Simeon is anepsios, cousin. A different word, a different category, an entirely different relationship. This matters enormously. It means that in the 2nd century, within living memory of the people who had known Jesus' family directly, Christian writers were carefully distinguishing between who was a brother and who was merely a relation. The brothers of Jesus were a documented, recognized group. Their names were preserved. Their relationships were tracked with precision. Hegesippus knew the difference between a brother and a cousin, and he recorded it. The sisters received none of this attention. Not one word in Hegesippus. Not one category. Not one name. Now here is where the question gets complicated in a way that matters. Because the ancient church did not agree on who the brothers of Jesus were, 3 different explanations circulated, and which explanation you accepted determined whether the sisters had any hope of being named at all. The first view, associated with Epiphanius of Salamis in the 4th century, held that Joseph was an old widower before he married Mary. He had been married before. He had children from that first marriage. Those children were James, Joses, Simon, Judas, and the unnamed sisters. In this view, the brothers and sisters of Jesus were his step-siblings, the older children of Joseph by a prior wife. The second view, associated with Jerome in the late 4th century, held that the brothers of Jesus were actually cousins, that the Greek word for brother was being used loosely, the way it sometimes was in Jewish culture. The third view held that the brothers and sisters were exactly what the word said they were, the biological children of Mary and Joseph, born after Jesus. But here is what's fascinating about those 3 views. Only one of them produced names for the sisters. Only one of them went far enough to identify who those women were. The Epiphanian view, the view that Joseph was a widower with a previous family, that view gave us names, and that view drew on a specific text, a text that the institutional church would simultaneously use and reject. That text was the Proto-Evangelium of James. It was written in the mid to late 2nd century in Greek, and it was attributed pseudonymously to James himself, the brother of Jesus, as if James had written down what he knew about Mary's origins and the circumstances of Jesus' birth. Scholars know it was not written by James, but it circulated as if it were, and it circulated widely. The earliest surviving manuscript of this text is a papyrus codex known as Papyrus Bodmer V, discovered in the early 1950s and dated to the 3rd or early 4th century. It is now housed at the Fondation Martin Bodmer in Cologne, Geneva, one of the great private manuscript collections in the world. And that single manuscript is not the whole of what survived. More than 140 manuscript copies of this text exist in Greek alone, with additional versions in Syriac, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopic, Old Slavonic, and Georgian. This was not an obscure document. This was read across the Christian world. What the Proto-Evangelium said about Jesus' family was clear. Joseph was an old widower. He had sons and daughters from a first marriage before Mary ever entered the picture. Those were the brothers and sisters who appear in Mark and Matthew, and that framework was the foundation on which Epiphanius would later build his argument, the foundation on which the tradition of naming the sisters would eventually rest. Then, around 495 A.D., the Church issued the Decretum Galatianum, a list of texts that were not to be considered authoritative. The Proto-Evangelium of James was on that list. Rejected, officially excluded, the document was banned. But the doctrine the document carried was not banned. The teaching that Mary was a perpetual virgin, that Joseph's prior children explained the brothers and sisters in the Gospels, that teaching became official Catholic and Orthodox belief and has remained so. The Church kept the doctrine and discarded the text. The text that implied the sisters existed and had a family framework was pushed out of the official record. The doctrine it generated was absorbed into the official record with the text's name removed. Tell me in the comments, did you know that Jesus had sisters? Were you ever taught this in church or in Sunday school? I am genuinely fascinated to know how much of this hidden record true seekers of truth like you already carry. Because here is the pattern that emerges when you step back. The canonical Gospels named women. They named Mary Magdalene. They named Joanna, the wife of Chusa. They named Susanna, whom Luke mentions in chapter 8, verse 3, as one of the women who provided for Jesus out of her own resources. Susanna appears exactly once, named once, and then she is gone. Even she got a name. Even a woman mentioned in a single verse that tells us almost nothing about her received the dignity of being identified. The sisters of Jesus appear twice in the Gospels and receive nothing. Not a name, not a verse of their own, not a moment of recognition. The brothers were tracked for generations. Hegesippus, writing in the 160s and 170s, preserved their names and their exact relationship to Jesus. Eusebius, writing in the early 300s, quoted Hegesippus and preserved those names again. The chain of documentation for the brothers of Jesus is unbroken across 2 centuries. The documentation for the sisters is a void, except in one text that circulated in Egypt in the 2nd century, copied and read and considered sacred by communities that no longer exist. One text where a woman named Salome sat with Jesus himself and spoke. One text that gave her questions and gave him answers and put both of them on the page together as if the conversation was too important to forget. That text is where we are going next. Before you can understand what was burned, you need to understand what you are looking for, because there is a trap here that has confused this story for decades, and if you fall into it, you miss everything. There are 2 ancient texts called the Gospel of the Egyptians. 2 separate documents, 2 completely different books, and the one that most people have heard about is not the one we are here for. The first Gospel of the Egyptians was found in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, buried in a sealed earthenware jar alongside 12 other leather-bound codices at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff. It is a Sethian Gnostic text. It is written in Coptic. It does not feature Salome. It survived because someone hid it in the desert before it could be destroyed, and the desert kept it for 16 centuries until a farmer's mattock struck the jar and the jar broke open. That text exists. You can read it. It is in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. That is not the gospel we are here for. The second Gospel of the Egyptians is the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, older, written around 120 to 150 AD, circulated across Egypt in communities that read it as sacred scripture, featuring Salome, featuring conversations between Salome and Jesus that no other surviving text records. And this gospel left no surviving manuscript, not one. It exists today only as fragments embedded in the writings of a man who quoted it while trying to destroy its influence. The gospel he was fighting against is the gospel where Salome speaks. That man was Clement of Alexandria. He was the head of the catechetical school of Alexandria, the intellectual center of early Christian thought, and he wrote in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. In his great work, the Stramata, his Miscellanies, he devoted the 3rd book to the subject of marriage and sexual ethics, and in that 3rd book He quoted extensively from the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, not to celebrate it, but to combat it. There was an Encretite teacher named Julius Cassianus, active around the year 150 AD, who had taken the Gospel of the Egyptians and used it as the foundation of his argument that celibacy was the path to salvation, that procreation was a spiritual error, that the body's desires were the enemy of the soul. Cassianus was the primary known user of this gospel. He had pulled specific dialogues from it and wielded them in theological argument. Clement needed to refute him. To do that, Clement had to quote the same text. And that is how we have what we have. 3 conversations between Salome and Jesus, preserved inside a refutation, given to history by the man who was arguing against them. This is the first dialogue, quoted from Clement's Stromata, Book 3, Chapter 6, verse 45. Salome asks Jesus a question, not a question about ritual, not a question about law, a question about the deepest wound in human existence. Salome says, "How long shall death hold sway?" And Jesus answers, "As long as ye women bear children." Hear what that exchange is. Salome is not asking about the afterlife in vague terms. She is not asking whether souls survive the body or whether heaven exists. She is asking about the origin of death itself, about the mechanism by which mortality entered the human condition, about what holds death in place and what could dissolve its power. She is engaging with a theological question that philosophy and religion had wrestled with for centuries before her, and would wrestle with for centuries after. And Jesus does not tell her the question is inappropriate. He does not tell her to go and listen to the men. He answers her. He engages with the question directly. He gives her a real answer to a real question. This is not a woman at the edge of the conversation. She is at its center. She is asking the questions, and he is answering them. And the exchange is being written down because someone considered it important enough to preserve and pass on. This is not the Salome that the canonical record gave you. The Salome of Mark is present but silent. The Salome of the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians asks Jesus about death. These are not the same portrait. The second dialogue comes from Stromata Book 3, Chapter 9, verse 66, where Clement quotes Julius Cassianus, quoting the Gospel. Salome asks again, "When will I know the answers to my questions?" And Jesus tells her this, "When you trample on the robe of shame, and when the two shall be one, and the male with the female, and there is neither male nor female." That answer is not strange to everyone who has read the apocryphal record. The same language surfaces in the Gospel of Thomas, the collection of 114 sayings of Jesus discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, written in Coptic but translated from a Greek original that scholars date between 50 and 140 AD. The same idea appears there, the restoration of unity, the dissolution of the divisions that fractured the original human wholeness. But in the Gospel of Thomas, that teaching is given to no one in particular. In the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, it is given to Salome. She is the one who asked. She is the one who received it. And here is what made that dangerous. If the division between male and female dissolves in spiritual truth, then the hierarchy built on that division dissolves with it. The institutional church of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries was constructing an authority structure that depended on that division being real and permanent and God-given. Bishops were men. Elders were men. The canon of Scripture was being assembled by men. If a gospel said that in the deepest spiritual reality there is neither male nor female, and if that gospel showed Jesus teaching that truth specifically to a woman who was asking questions from a position of discipleship, then the entire architecture of male ecclesial authority had a problem on its hands. Rome could not allow that. Not in a world where institutional power required institutional justification, and that justification required the hierarchy to be natural and ordained rather than constructed and contingent. The third dialogue, Stromata 3.13.92. Salome has been listening, questioning, absorbing, and she draws a conclusion from what she has heard. She says, "I have done well then in not bearing children." And Jesus answers, "Eat every plant, but do not eat the one that has bitterness." 3 separate dialogues, 3 exchanges preserved through one man's attempt to discredit them. But this is not the only ancient text that places Salome in conversation with Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas, Logion 61, tells a different story. Jesus appears at Salome's table. He reclines on her couch. He eats from her table. And she asks who he is. He tells her he comes from the one who is equal, from the undivided. And then she says the words that no woman says to any teacher in any canonical gospel. She says, "I am your disciple." The Greek word behind that declaration, in the Coptic text of the Gospel of Thomas, is the feminine form of the word for disciple. That feminine form is extraordinarily rare in ancient religious literature. It appears here because whoever wrote this text needed a word that specifically described a woman who was a follower of Jesus in the full sense of that word. Salome was not a bystander. She was not a witness from a distance. She was a disciple. 2 separate ancient texts from 2 different traditions say so. Now step back from what you have just heard. The 3 dialogues from the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians exist only inside Clement's Stromata. No manuscript of that Gospel has ever been found. Not in a desert cave, not in a monastery library, not in any private collection anywhere on earth. The text that contained these conversations does not exist as an independent document. It is classified among lost manuscripts as completely and totally gone, a gospel that circulated between 120 and 150 AD and left no physical trace except what an opponent preserved while arguing against it. That is not an accident. That is what it looks like when something is removed. The Greek Gospel of the Egyptians is not the only place where Salome's name is connected to the inner circle of Jesus. There is one more witness, one more ancient writer who looked at the family of Jesus, who examined the question of who those brothers and sisters were, and who wrote down names that the canonical record refused to give. His name was Epiphanius of Salamis. He lived from around the year 310 to 403 AD. He was a bishop. He was a heresiologist, which means his entire vocation was hunting heresy, cataloguing it, refuting it, and warning the faithful against it. He wrote a massive work called the Panarion, which means the medicine chest against heresies, and in it he described and condemned 80 separate heresies in meticulous, sometimes obsessive detail. Epiphanius was not a sympathetic figure by modern standards. He was the Church's enforcer against heterodox belief. The same traditions he catalogued, he condemned. The same texts he described, he worked to suppress. He believed he was protecting the faith, and he did it with the ferocity of someone who considered error to be a form of spiritual poison. But here is what happened with Epiphanius, the same thing that happened with Clement. The heresy hunters preserved what they attacked, because to refute something you have to describe it. To warn against a tradition, you have to document it. And Epiphanius, in writing about the communities that venerated the sisters of Jesus and considered their names part of the sacred record, wrote those names down himself. Around the year 375 AD, in the second book of his Panarion, Epiphanius turned his attention to a group he called the Antidicamarianites. That name means the opponents of Mary. These were Christians who denied the perpetual virginity of Mary, who argued that after the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph had a normal marriage and normal children. To refute them, Epiphanius had to establish exactly who the brothers and sisters of Jesus were, and where they came from. And he did. He laid out the framework that he drew from the proto-evangelium tradition. Joseph was an old widower, he said. Before he married Mary, he had a family. He had sons, and he had daughters. Then Epiphanius names them. The daughters of Joseph, the step-sisters of Jesus, he identifies as Mary and Salome. Mary and Salome. For 2,000 years, the canonical Gospels had said, his sisters, and nothing more. Not their names, not their faces, not what they did when the movement their brother started turned the world upside down. 2 words, a mention and a silence. And now, from a bishop who was trying to argue against heresy rather than support it, in a text written to refute the opponents of Mary's virginity rather than to champion the sisters of Jesus, the names emerge from the silence where they had been buried. 2 daughters of Joseph by his first wife, Mary and Salome. Before Epiphanius, the sisters of Jesus were a rumor embedded in 2 gospel verses. After him, there are names in the historical record, set down by a church official who had every reason to be precise, because precision was the point of everything he wrote. But here's what's crucial. Epiphanius didn't invent those names. He drew them from a tradition older than his own writing. He drew them from the framework of the proto-evangelium of James, the same text we encountered in the last chapter, the text the church officially rejected while quietly absorbing its doctrines about Mary's perpetual virginity. The proto-evangelium was banned. The teaching it carried survived, and buried inside that teaching, preserved by the very act of using the framework Epiphanius needed to make his argument, were the names of the sisters. Now step back and look at what the evidence has assembled. Salome's name appears in 3 entirely separate streams of the ancient record. The first stream is the canonical Gospels, Mark chapter 15, verse 40, and chapter 16, verse 1. Salome at the cross, Salome at the tomb. A named woman in the innermost circle, present at the 2 most consequential moments in that story, whose relationship to Jesus' family is never explained. The second stream is the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, circulating from around 120 to 150 AD. Salome as the theological interlocutor of Jesus, asking him about death and unity and the condition of the soul, being called his disciple in a feminine form of that word that appears nowhere else in ancient religious literature. The third stream is Epiphanius of Salamis, writing around 375 AD in his Panarion, naming the daughters of Joseph as Mary and Salome. Same name. 3 separate traditions, 3 separate centuries, all converging on the same woman. Now there is a 4th document that adds one more piece, the Gospel of Philip. It was found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, buried in that sealed jar with the other 13 codices. It is the 3rd tractate of Nag Hammadi Codex II. Scholars date its composition to Syria in the late 2nd or 3rd century, translated from Greek into Coptic, and it contains a sentence that has never received the attention it deserves. According to the Gospel of Philip, there were 3 who always walked with the Lord: Mary, his mother, and her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. Her sister. The Virgin Mary had a sister who walked with the Lord. That sister is not named in this passage. She exists in the text as her sister, defined by her relationship to Mary, exactly the way the unnamed woman at the cross in John 19 is defined by her relationship to Mary, but read alongside Epiphanius, who names the sister of Mary's family as Salome, the picture sharpens. The Gospel of Philip survived because it was buried before it could be destroyed. The Greek Gospel of the Egyptians did not survive because no one buried it in time. And then there is what happened in the south of France. In the Camargue, on the coast of the Mediterranean, there is a town called Sainte Marie de la Mer, the Holy Mary of the Sea. According to a tradition, that the Roman Catholic Church never officially sanctioned, but never fully suppressed. After the crucifixion, Mary Salome and Mary Jacobet were set adrift in a boat with no oars, no sail, no means of navigation, and the sea carried them west to the coast of what is now southern France, where they landed and where they stayed. The town takes its name all from them. Every year in May, the statue of their servant, Sara la Kali, Sarah the Black, patron saint of the Romani people, is lifted from the crypt of the ancient church and carried in procession into the Mediterranean. Pilgrims have come to that shore for centuries. The Roman Catholic Church never formally recognized Sarah la Kali as a saint. Yet the tradition has persisted without authorization, without approval, without the institutional blessing that most Christian veneration requires, because the communities that carried it did not need the institution's permission. They remembered what the institution forgot. Salome's name lives on the coast of France, carried into the sea every May by the people who kept her memory when the official record would not. We are living in days when what was buried is clawing its way back into the light. If you want to go deeper into what the forbidden record says about the family of Jesus and the women who walked with him, the link to our full ebook is in the pinned comment below. Everything we have covered and much more, sourced and documented. Take it with you, because what comes next is the question you have been building toward since the beginning. Not who Salome was. We know who she was. The question is who decided her story needed to disappear, and how they did it. The Church did not invent the practice of suppressing Gospels in the 4th century. The practice was older than that. The precedent had been set 200 years earlier, and it had been set clearly enough that everyone who came after it knew exactly how it worked. Around the year 200 AD, a bishop named Serapion was the Patriarch of Antioch. A Christian congregation in the town of Rossus had been reading the Gospel of Peter in their church services. Serapion had originally permitted this without reading it carefully. Then concerns were brought to his attention. He obtained a copy. What he found was a theological problem he considered serious. The Gospel of Peter contained traces of docetism, the teaching that Jesus did not truly suffer on the cross, that the crucifixion was, in some sense, an appearance rather than a reality. The text said that on the cross, Jesus was silent, as if he felt no pain. Serapion withdrew his permission. He wrote a letter to the congregation. He forbade the Gospel of Peter from being read in their services. He explained his reasoning. And Eusebius of Caesarea, the historian who preserved so much of the early church record in his ecclesiastical history, documented what Serapion did. According to the historical record that Eusebius preserved, this is the first known case of a bishop formally suppressing a gospel, not arguing against it in a theological treatise, not placing it on a list of disputed books, actively withdrawing permission for it to be used as scripture and ordering the congregation to stop. The principle was now established. A bishop had the authority to decide that a text was dangerous and remove it. That precedent existed, documented in writing, for every bishop who came after. Now jump forward. The year is 423 AD. A bishop named Theodore has just been appointed to the See of Cyrrhus, in what is now northern Syria. He will hold that position until his death around 458 AD, and in the year he takes his post, he does something that has no equivalent anywhere else in the documented history of Christianity in terms of sheer scale. There was a text called the Diatessaron, composed around 170 AD by a man named Tatian. It was a single continuous harmony of all 4 canonical Gospels woven into one narrative. For 250 years it had been the standard gospel text of the Syriac-speaking churches. People across the region had never read the 4 Gospels separately. The Diatessaron was what they had been handed when they became Christians, and what they had read aloud in their services for generations. Theodoret went through his diocese personally, According to his own account in a work called the Hereticarum Fabularum Compendium, he found more than 200 copies of the Diatessaron in the churches under his authority and removed them. He replaced everyone with the 4 separate Gospels, more than 200 copies, gone, by his own hand, his own decision, without a council vote or an imperial decree. No complete ancient manuscript of the Diatessaron survived. What we know of it today comes from a commentary on it, an Arabic version, a small Greek fragment, and reconstructions assembled from secondary sources. The text that hundreds of thousands of Christians had considered sacred scripture for 2.5 centuries simply ceased to exist as a physical object in the churches where it had been read. That is what is possible. That is the documented scale of what one bishop can do. Easter, 367 A.D. Athanasius of Alexandria writes his annual letter to the churches under his authority. He has been exiled 5 separate times by emperors who disagreed with his theology and has returned 5 times. By 367 A.D., he is around 71 years old and is the most powerful theological voice in the Eastern Church. In this letter, his 39th festal letter, he does something no Christian document had ever done before. He lists exactly 27 books as the New Testament, the same 27 books in your Bible today. And then he writes the words that decided the fate of everything else. No one may add to them, and nothing may be taken away from them. The monks at the Pachomian monastery of Chenoboskion, near a bend in the Nile in Upper Egypt, close to the town of Nag Hammadi, understood what that letter meant. They had texts they used, texts they valued, texts they believed preserved genuine knowledge, texts that were now, after Athanasius's letter, officially outside the authorized canon. So they did what people do when they cannot keep something openly and cannot bear to destroy it. They put 13 leather-bound papyrus codices into a sealed earthenware jar, carried that jar to the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff, buried it in the desert, and left. The Gospel of Thomas was in that jar. The Gospel of Philip was in that jar. They survive today because those monks hid them before the order to destroy them could reach them. The Greek Gospel of the Egyptians was not in that jar. Why not? Because by 367 A.D., the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians had already been under sustained attack for more than 150 years. Clement of Alexandria had used it as a polemical target around the year 200. The communities who had read it, the Ankratite groups for whom Salome's dialogues with Jesus were sacred, had been scattered and condemned for 1.5 centuries. There was no monastery protecting the text, no bishop holding copies, no community of believers who still had it in their possession when Athanasius issued his letter. The Nag Hammadi monks buried what they had. They did not have the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians. It was already gone. Its destruction was not a single event. It was a process. 150 years of institutional pressure that made it dangerous to possess, dangerous to copy, dangerous to transmit, until the communities who had valued it were too scattered and too suppressed to pass it on. And then there was nothing left to pass on. Here is what the Church never said. It never said, "We are burning this gospel because it names the sister of Jesus." That was not the stated reason. The stated reasons were theological. The text was used by Onkratites, who promoted celibacy as the path to salvation. The text was associated with groups the institutional church had condemned as heretical. The text was not authoritative scripture. Those reasons were real. Those reasons are documented. The theological motive was genuine. But the effect was this. The text that gave Salome a name and a voice and a seat at the conversation with Jesus was destroyed. The text where a woman asked Jesus about death and he answered her, where a woman asked about the unity of the soul and he told her, where a woman declared herself his disciple in the feminine form of that word, and he accepted it. That text no longer exists. What remained in its place was the official canonical record where the Sisters of Jesus appear twice and are never given names. They were there. Mark 6:3, Matthew 13:55-56. The Sisters of Jesus were real. They lived in the same town as him, ate at the same table, were known by the same community. They just were not allowed to speak. And the text that had given one of them a voice was gone before anyone with the power to demand it had to say a word about sisters. What survived? 3 dialogues preserved inside Clement's stromata, kept alive because Clement needed to argue against them. The name Salome in Mark's Gospel, at the cross in chapter 15, and at the tomb in chapter 16, unexplained, unconnected to the family she may have belonged to. The names Mary and Salome in Epiphanius's Panarion, written down by a heresy hunter who had no intention of honoring the sisters, but could not make his argument without naming them. The phrase, her sister, in the Gospel of Philip, buried in the desert and returned to the world in 1945, and the pilgrimage at Sainte Marie de la Mer in the south of France, where the name Mary Salome is still spoken every May by people who carried it through the centuries the official record could not reach. That is what 1700 years of institutional suppression left behind. Not nothing, but almost nothing. We started with a verse. Mark chapter 6, verse 3. Are not his sisters here with us? 2 words where names should have been, a presence acknowledged and immediately made invisible. The Sisters of Jesus existed. They were in that town. The community that knew Jesus personally confirmed it. And for 2,000 years the canonical record gave them nothing but those 2 words and silence. That silence ends here. Her name was Salome. That is the answer. Not a theory. Not a possibility. The oldest surviving record that names the daughters of Joseph names her. Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in his Panarion around the year 375 AD, set it down. 2 daughters, one named Mary and one named Salome. She is named in the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, the text that circulated across Egypt from around 120 to 150 AD, the text where she sits with Jesus and speaks with him and receives from him the kind of answer that tells you the person asking was trusted. She is named in the memory that communities in southern France carried to a coastline where her name is still spoken today. And the other sister, Mary, named alongside Salome by Epiphanius, she shares a name with her stepmother, with Mary Magdalene, with Mary of Clopas, with half the women in the New Testament. She has been so completely absorbed into the noise of that name that she has become invisible even in the record that almost preserved her. The woman most thoroughly erased is the one whose name most resembled those of the women the Church was willing to keep. Now think about what Salome's questions mean, not the theological debates around them, what they mean about who she was. She asked about death. She looked at Jesus and asked how long death would hold sway over human experience. That is not a peripheral question. That is the central question of every religion that has ever existed. She asked it. He answered it. And the text recorded both. She asked when she would know the truth. When would understanding arrive? When would the division between what she perceived and what was real finally dissolve? She asked about the unity that lies beneath the surface of a fractured world. And he told her, when you have moved past shame, when the two become one, when the distinctions that divide have been healed. She asked whether the path she had chosen was right. He told her to eat every plant, except the bitter one. An answer that trusted her to interpret it, that gave her wisdom rather than instruction, that addressed her as someone capable of discernment. These are not the questions of someone standing at a distance from the conversation. These are the questions of someone in the room, someone close enough to ask and close enough to receive. And the Gospel of Thomas placed her at her own table, with Jesus as her guest, and had her declare in the feminine form of the word that no canonical gospel ever applied to a woman in that context. I am your disciple. The canonical record kept her at the cross in Mark chapter 15. It kept her at the tomb in Mark chapter 16. It placed her among the small group of people present at the two moments that defined the entire story, the two moments that the rest of the male disciples missed entirely because they had already fled. And then it refused to say who she was. It kept her presence and removed her identity. It preserved the fact of her and erased the meaning of her, the way you might cut a face from a photograph while leaving the outline where the face had been, so the viewer knows something was there, but cannot say what. But there are communities that kept the face. The people of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, in the south of France, have been carrying Mary Salome's name to the sea for centuries. Every May, they lift the statue of Sara la Kali, Sara the Black, patron of the Romani people, from the crypt of the ancient church on the Camargue coast, and they carry her into the Mediterranean. The Roman Catholic Church never formally recognized Sara la Kali as a saint. No council authorized this tradition. No Vatican decree legitimized it. It persisted because the communities who held it didn't need institutional permission to remember what they remembered. That persistence is testimony of a different kind. Not the testimony of a manuscript discovered in a sealed jar, not the testimony of a bishop who wrote something down, the testimony of ordinary people across centuries who refused to let a name go down into silence just because the institution at the center of their tradition had stopped saying it. You are part of the reason it did not go down entirely. You uncovered the silence in Mark chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 13, where 4 brothers were given names and the sisters were given nothing, not because women went unnamed in ancient texts, but because someone decided these particular women would go unnamed. You learned that a 2nd century gospel, the Greek gospel of the Egyptians, featured Salome as Jesus's theological interlocutor, giving her questions about death and unity and the condition of the soul, giving her answers that trusted her to receive them, giving her the one word the canonical record withheld, disciple. You discovered that the only reason those dialogues survived at all is that Clement of Alexandria quoted them while trying to destroy their influence. He preserved them by condemning them. He gave us her voice in the act of arguing against it. You found that Epiphanius of Salamis, bishop and heresiologist of the 4th century, named the sisters of Jesus in his Panarion, Mary and Salome, written down by a man whose entire life was devoted to hunting heresy, who had no intention of honoring these women, but who could not make his argument without naming them. You understood that the Greek gospel of the Egyptians was not accidentally lost. It was the result of 150 years of institutional pressure, of condemned communities, of texts made dangerous to hold, until there was no one left to hide it in the sand, the way the monks of Nag Hammadi hid the texts they loved. It is not coincidence that you are watching this now. It is not coincidence that these documents are accessible, that these names can be spoken, that the silence that held for 17 centuries is finally something that can be broken and spoken into and filled. Subscribe to this channel and activate the bell so you do not miss a single revelation. Because in the next video, we are going to talk about someone who is not a sister of Jesus, but who was called his wife. The document that names her. The scholar who announced it to the world in 2012. And what happened when she had to take it back. There was a sister of Jesus. Her name was Salome. There was a gospel that named her. The church buried every copy until nothing was left. What survived only because the man who worked hardest to bury it had to quote it in order to condemn it. and in the act of condemnation, across 1800 years, he gave us her voice. That voice has been waiting in the margins of a refutation for all of that time. Now you have